Hey guys, tonight we're rattling down a soggy country road in a carriage that smells faintly of sweat leather and dairy. There's mud splashed up the coach door, your boots are wet, and the driver up top just let out a sneeze loud enough to scare the crows. This isn't a glamorous ride. It's the dawn of Britain's mail coach era, and you've just bought yourself a seat through the rain-soaked chaos of 18th century infrastructure. If you've ever complained about waiting in line at the post office, well, you probably wouldn't survive this. Because here in the Georgian countryside, express delivery means trusting your parcel to a contraption that might tip into a ditch if the horses sneeze. And if you're wondering why there's a suspiciously heavy wheel of cheese nestled by the mailbags, well, let's just say that's part of tonight's mystery. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time. I love knowing where in the world we're dozing off together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're squelching through a muddy roadside footpath in the late 1700s, the kind of gray afternoon that seems to soak straight into your bones. A creaking wooden mail coach lurches past, splattering your cloak, as the driver snaps his reins and mutters something unintelligible through a dripping scarf. It's not exactly an inspiring sight. Yet this ramshackle contraption is the cutting edge of national communication, and it's about to change everything slowly and soggily. Before the mail coach system, letters could take weeks to limp from one town to another, passed by a chaotic string of footmen innkeepers, and sometimes just a guy on a donkey named Harold. The mail was often late lost or slightly chewed, and during wartime, forget it. British generals during the 7 Years' War were famously frustrated by mail delays. Some orders arrived long after the battles they referred to. It was less strategic correspondence and more extremely slow gossip. Enter John Palmer, a theater owner from Bath of all things. He wasn't a postmaster or a nobleman or anyone particularly connected to government logistics. But Palmer liked things that ran on time, especially stagecoaches carrying actors and wigs. In 1784, he convinced the government to test a new mail delivery method based on stagecoach principles, faster carriages, limited stops, and a schedule so strict it could shave a beard. The trial run was a success. Letters that once took days reached their destinations overnight. The King George III reportedly said, "This is no longer a lottery," which in Georgian speak was a rave review. And just like that, the Royal Mail coach system was born, complete with formal uniforms, appointed guards, and timetables more rigid than a British butler at a French picnic. But the roads, oh, the roads. Picture this, you're rattling over a patchwork of uneven cobbles, dirt trails, and rickety bridges. Every bounce of the coach feels like it might jolt your teeth into the next town. The main arteries of England were laughably inconsistent. One stretch would be paved and fine the next, so muddy that even ducks refused to cross. To make matters worse, Britain's infamous turnpikes meant every few miles you had to stop and pay a toll. Guards would examine the vehicle, weigh it, and note any suspicious freight, which, yes, included particularly dense wheels of cheddar. More on that later. Coaches ran through rain, sleet, snow, and fog thick enough to swallow horses. Drivers had to memorize routes down to the pothole. Staging inns sprang up along the paths like pit stops in an endurance race, with fresh horses waiting to be swapped in with military precision. The goal was simple: get the mail through on time or risk royal displeasure and public embarrassment. No pressure. Now riding on one of these mail coaches was technically possible for passengers, but not recommended if you valued your spine. There was no interior cabin for you to nap in. Most travelers sat up top, clinging to a slippery rail and praying their hat didn't fly off into the hedgerows. And if it rained, which it usually did, you just got wet. The only upside. At least you'd arrive faster than the guy on the donkey. One curious feature of this mail system was the obsession with consistency. The coaches had to weigh roughly the same each trip to ensure predictable speeds and brake timing. And that brings us rather unexpectedly to cheese. See, when mail volume was low on holidays or in remote areas, postmasters needed to fill the coach to its standard weight. You couldn't just send it out light. The horses were trained for a specific pull, and the brakes were calibrated accordingly. So how do you pad out your payload when the letter bags are light simple? Cheese. Hard round, predictable in weight, and conveniently edible if stranded cheese became the unofficial ballast of the British postal system. And not just any cheese, heavy, dense wheels like Gloucestershire Double and Wiltshire Loaf. Some were even stamped for postal use, though historians still argue whether those marks denoted official cargo or just enthusiastic dairy producers hoping for free advertising. And so it became common, if slightly absurd, for a coach to carry a government dispatch, 2 velvet-caped passengers, a coach guard with a pistol, and somewhere under the bench, a 28-pound wheel of semi-hard cheese. Quirky, yes, but it worked. And in a country where rainfall is practically a national sport, you learn to appreciate the small comforts, like knowing your mail arrived slightly cheesy, but right on time. You're gripping the side rail now, knuckles pale as the coach thunders downhill, hooves clattering on uneven flagstones. The driver whistles sharply, twice short, once long, and the team of 4 horses adjusts like dancers in a muddy ballet. Below the wheels, screech through a puddle deep enough to qualify as a pond. You're not just traveling, you're witnessing the invention of something quietly radical: the timetable. Before the mail coach system, travel time was a vague suggestion. Maybe Tuesday was considered punctual, but the Royal Mail, inspired by Palmer's theater managing instincts and the Crown's need to tighten its imperial communications, decided enough was enough. Thus began the age of obsessive scheduling. Each route had its own timetable posted publicly at inns and mail offices. These weren't flexible guides, they were strict mandates. If a coach left York at 6:00 p.m., it had better be at Newark by 1:00 a.m. and in London by dawn. Drivers were fined for lateness. Guards recorded times to the minute. People began setting their watches by the sound of the mail horn in the distance. The post didn't just move faster, it moved like clockwork. And with that predictability came prestige. You weren't just watching some hay cart bounce down a lane. You were witnessing a national promise, keeping time. It wasn't just the passengers who noticed. Farmers along the route could set their milking schedules by the coach's arrival. Bakers started timing their bread proofing to match departures, and village children, half excited, half terrified, would sometimes line up to salute the guard, whose uniform included a scarlet coat, tall hat, and sword. You looked like a royal, even if you smelled like horse. Of course, it wasn't all smooth riding. The roads, as mentioned, remained a challenge. Britain's love affair with toll roads, known as turnpikes, meant that mail coaches were constantly stopping to pay their way. Each toll booth had its own keeper, often a sleepy-eyed man with a wax-sealed ledger and a candle burning down to a stub. And tolls weren't just about the vehicle, they were about what it carried and how much it weighed. Which brings us to the next complication: the horses. If the coach was too light, the horses trained for specific loads would pull unevenly, risking injury or damage to the carriage. Too heavy and the coach slowed, missed its schedule, or worse, broke an axle on a rut-covered descent. The answer, a delicate balance. And so mail guards and drivers became experts in load management, improvising with whatever was available to hit the target weight. Raincoats, bundles of newspapers, sacks of grain, and yes, increasingly often, wheels of cheese. Cheese was especially useful because it was dense, non-fragile, stackable, and came in standardized sizes. A 25-pound cheddar didn't wiggle like a bag of flour or burst like a jug of mead. If it got cold, the cheese didn't crack. If it got hot, well, it just softened a little. And it could double as a snack if needed. Soon, cheese weight became a coach-side term. Guards would glance at a half-empty luggage rack and mutter, "We're 2 cheeses short," and that wasn't hyperbole, it was a rough estimate. In some cases, drivers even made small side agreements with dairymen near the staging inns, picking up wheels on the way south to fill out the payload, and returning them or fresh ones on the way back north. Cheese as weight ballast snack and barter currency, welcome to the Georgian supply chain. Now this was no formal policy, no royal edict demanded the presence of Gloucester's finest dairy per coach. But it happened often enough that travelers started noticing, and so did toll collectors. Some toll houses began weighing the entire coach to determine fees, noting if it exceeded a certain number of stones, the Georgian unit of 14 pounds. A passenger might overhear the toll keeper mumbling, "over by 1.5 cheese wheels," and know exactly what that meant. And yet, because of the schedule, no one dared delay long enough to argue. Pay the toll, move on, stay on time. There were even reports of postmasters quietly reimbursing guards for supplemental dairy, though historians still argue whether that was officially sanctioned or just a very British workaround. As this strange dance between scheduling weight and weather continued, the drivers themselves became minor celebrities. Known for their stoic expressions, legendary stomachs, and ability to quote mileage by heart, they were the human backbone of Britain's most ambitious logistics experiment to date, and they were punctual. Guards timed stops down to the minute. Horse swaps could take as little as 2 minutes with a fresh team ready and harnessed as the coach wheeled in. You, the bleary-eyed traveler, might barely have time to sip your watered ale before hearing the horn and rushing to leap aboard again. No time to chat. No time to warm up. The mail waits for no one, not even the guy in the back who really needed to pee. This obsession with precision spread. Town clocks were adjusted to match mail coach arrival times. The phrase mail coach punctuality became shorthand for anything weirdly on time in an otherwise chaotic world. But perhaps the oddest outcome of this system was the psychological effect. People began to expect order, to trust that the coach would arrive. That a letter posted in Cornwall on Monday could really be read in London by Wednesday. That a small wheel of cheese might be carried 100 miles, never unpacked, never eaten, and yet essential to the whole machine. It was this quiet dependability, delivered at speed and slightly smelling of cheddar, that helped knit together a rapidly modernizing Britain. Roads were still rough. Weather was still miserable. But the mail was moving like a dream. So next time your parcel takes 3 days to arrive, just remember at least no one had to weigh it next to a wheel of cheese first. The coach door thuds shut behind you with a squeal of iron hinges, and the driver calls out something cheerfully unintelligible, probably a weather complaint or a horse insult. You settle into your damp, straw-padded seat next to a burlap sack of correspondence and something suspiciously round under a canvas cloth. You nudge it with your boot. Yep, that's cheese. But this isn't just some coachman's lunch. That hefty wheel has a purpose. In fact, it has a quota. At first glance, the idea of a cheese quota on Georgian-era mail coaches sounds like a punchline. You might imagine a government official with a powdered wig solemnly weighing a wedge of cheddar beside the royal seal. But under the veneer of absurdity lies a deeply practical, if quirky, system that helped regulate one of the most advanced logistical networks of the 18th century. See, once the Royal Mail coaches started thundering across the countryside with their fixed timetables and precision stops, everything had to be standardized, especially weight. A coach too heavy would struggle on hills, stall in mud, or snap an axle. A coach too light would bounce uncontrollably, strain the harnesses, or cause the brakes to engage too sharply. Either way, it was a liability. And while the mailbags were supposed to weigh roughly the same per trip, well, reality isn't always that tidy. Some days the post from York might include a stack of parliamentary letters, 2 legal summonses, and a package of hand-pressed liniment for a dowager's corns. Other days, just 1 letter written in tiny handwriting and a dead wasp squashed in the wax seal. So when things got light, especially on rural routes, coachmen and guards had a trick. They supplemented the mail load with predictably dense objects, and none were more beloved than the humble wheel of cheese. It wasn't just because it was heavy, it was also uniform. Cheesemakers, particularly those producing Gloucester, Cheshire, or Lancashire varieties, used standardized molds. A proper wheel could be anywhere from 20 to 60 pounds depending on style, and came with a firm rind and robust shape. You could stack them, strap them under benches, wedge them near the brake lever. In a system where horses and wheels were calibrated to half-stone increments, cheese provided a comforting consistency. And so the cheese quota emerged, not a formal law exactly, but an understood necessity. Postal depots, especially those near dairy-producing regions, would keep a small stash of coach cheese on hand. Guards knew the weight of each by heart. A shortfall in mailbags, add 2 Gloucesters and a Lancashire. Too much post, swap out the big wheel for a couple of half-crowns worth of Cheshire. Drivers became part-time dairy logisticians. And yes, sometimes they ate the quota. Not often, but occasionally, after a long, rainy shift with no inn for miles, a guard might accidentally misplace a small cheese and later replace it from their own pay. It was easier than explaining to the inspector why the coach had arrived half a stone light and smelling of onions. Now historians still argue whether this cheese balancing act was truly institutional or simply a widespread folk practice. Some postal records from the Bath and Gloucester region do include cryptic inventory notations like 1 unit ballast cheese or weight equalized dairy applied. Other sources hint that some innkeepers rented out wheels specifically for coach use, slotted onto a scale, and then tucked back into the cellar once the mail moved on. There are even stories, likely exaggerated, of guards being reprimanded for overusing dairy. One anonymous entry from 1792 jokes about a coach arriving laden more with cheese than letters, but at least it was prompt. Whether that was critique or dry British humor remains unclear. The cheese also served a subtler purpose. In a time before modern packaging goods were often shipped wrapped in cloth or waxed paper prone to spoilage or collapse, cheese, especially aged varieties, held up to the brutal conditions inside a coach, jolting damp and occasionally the trampling of a passenger's boots. Unlike barrels or lead weights, cheese could also be used, later eaten by staff, sold in town, or returned to its source for future trips. It became, in short, the perfect Georgian-era solution, practical, edible, and faintly ridiculous. Some enterprising dairymen saw an opportunity. In markets near staging posts, cheese was labeled not just by age and origin, but by coach grade. These were denser, drier, and less prone to squish than softer table cheeses. One popular local brand even included a wax seal that mimicked the Royal Mail crest, just cheeky enough to raise eyebrows, but not lawsuits. The public, of course, caught wind of this practice. Travel journals from the time described curious passengers spotting stacks of cheese being wheeled toward the carriage with the same urgency as letter bags. One lady en route from Exeter described in her diary a striking display of government cheddar being loaded by two red-faced porters, while a guard barked orders and timed the transfer with a pocket watch. She was not amused, but her coach did arrive 15 minutes early, and in small towns, the cheese quota became the stuff of mild legend. Children would try to guess how many were on board as the coach rumbled by. Bakers timed their pies to match the rhythm of the wheel-stacked vehicle. Local gossip sometimes revolved around who had loaned their prized double Gloucester to the postal depot that week, proudly or suspiciously, depending on how hungry they were. It all culminates in this curious truth. The efficiency of Georgian communication may have been held together quite literally by cheese. In the quiet math of weight ratios, timing charts, and wobbly roads, those firm wheels became both symbol and solution, stabilizing a system constantly teetering between innovation and absurdity. And you cozy under your itchy wool blanket and seatmate to a gently sweating Cheshire are now part of that rich, weird tradition. You shift slightly in your seat, careful not to jostle the canvas-wrapped cheese next to your knee. Across from you, the male guard is half-dozing, one gloved hand on his pistol, the other resting lightly on a satchel stuffed with correspondence. The coach wheels thrum with a steady rhythm, clop, clop, bounce, sigh, and outside hedgerows blur into the blue-gray smudge of evening. Then without warning, the coach lurches to a halt. The driver swears politely. Of course, it's still Britain, and the male guard straightens like he's been zapped. Outside the window, lantern light flickers across a small toll gate. Another tollkeeper in a lopsided tricorn hat steps forward holding a weighted stick and a sheaf of parchment. And here you witness the surreal drama of the cheese quota played out under the veil of bureaucracy and suspicion. Coach waits up, the tollkeeper mutters, eyeing the undercarriage with the narrowed look of a man who smelled something cheesy before. Got more than just letters in there. The guard doesn't flinch. Ballast. Authorized. Ballast is it? The tollkeeper lifts the stick, balancing it like a wizard's staff. Smells like cheddar. And this is where things get weird. Because as strange as it sounds, one of the most hotly debated issues among Georgian toll collectors wasn't smugglers or counterfeit stamps, but whether the cheese in your coach was luggage or lunch. You see, under the laws governing toll roads, passenger belongings and commercial cargo were taxed differently. A person could travel with food for personal use. Ham apples, the occasional emotionally neglected turnip, and not be charged extra. But if that food was being transported for delivery or used to balance coach weight like a sack of bricks, it counted as cargo and incurred higher fees. Cheese was the loophole. If it was tucked beside a guard's satchel, lunch. If it was strapped under the axle to stabilize the frame, cargo. If the coach happened to be light that day, and the postmaster added 2 wheels from the inn's larder, dubious. And so, a cheese's status snack or shipment determined its tax rate. Naturally, arguments erupted at gates. Drivers protested, guards swore oaths, tollkeepers sniffed wheels suspiciously and even poked at rinds with sticks to determine firmness. There are recorded cases of cheese being cut open on the spot. If it was soft, it was clearly edible and probably for personal use. If it was rock hard and wrapped in waxed linen, stamped with a weight, it might be ballast. One notorious case at the Whitchurch Turnpike involved a guard who insisted his 3 hefty wheels were part of his supper parcel. The tollkeeper, unimpressed, charged the full rate anyway. The guard paid it, but reportedly muttered about feeding the tollman to his own horse. This blurriness made coaches get creative. Guards would sometimes write the cheese into the passenger manifest as if it were a paying traveler, one Mr. Stilton seated under bench. Others simply hid it beneath cloaks or straw sacks. There's even an apocryphal tale of a coach arriving in London with a wheel of cheese dressed in a child's bonnet, and listed as Miss G. Gloucester. Historians still argue whether that one's real or just the product of a bored innkeeper's sense of humor. But it speaks to a larger truth: everyone was playing the game. Coaches under pressure to stay on schedule and keep costs low bent the rules. Toll keepers under pressure to bring in revenue for their roads enforced with flair. Passengers mostly tried not to get involved unless, of course, they were transporting cheese of their own. In that case, all bets were off. And yes, some people absolutely traveled with cheese. Wealthier passengers, especially those on long routes between dairy regions and London, might bring along a personal wheel, gifts, trade samples, or simply family pride. One account describes a Somerset merchant who sat with his arms wrapped lovingly around his cheese the entire journey to Oxford, refusing to let it out of his sight. When a guard jokingly asked if it had a name, the merchant replied, "Only sir, if you please." Of course, for most people, cheese was less a precious companion and more a practical tool. It didn't spoil easily, it didn't leak. It made a better footrest than a ham. And in the right coach on the right day, it could mean the difference between a smooth ride and a jarring stop at every suspiciously curious toll gate in Wiltshire. And so a strange culture emerged, one where dairy knowledge became postal expertise. Guards could identify a cheese's moisture content by thump. Drivers knew which staging inns had wheels closest to the 28-pound ideal. Even toll keepers developed a nose for age region and rind density. It became part of the rhythm of the mail system: load the letters, weigh the bags, add 2 cheeses, argue at the gate, ride like mad. You meanwhile doze slightly jostled every few minutes as the coach climbs another ridge. Somewhere in the dark, another toll gate is coming. You imagine the guard practicing his cheese face. You imagine the toll keeper rubbing his hands with anticipatory suspicion. And beneath your boots, the reassuring firmness of a double Gloucester helps keep everything steady. There's a strange kind of comfort in it, really. Cheese not just for eating anymore, but for balancing bureaucracy too. You wake with a start as the coach thuds through a pothole large enough to drown a goose. A muffled curse from the driver, a rattle of packages, and that unmistakable low thunk of something round and dairy-shaped shifting beneath your seat. The cheese has moved. Again. You glance down. Still there. Still snug against the coach's wooden floorboards, wrapped in its linen shroud like a slightly sacred wheel of mystery. This particular wheel, roughly 30 pounds, judging by how it nudged your boots, has now endured more bouncing than your spine. And it's holding up far better than you. Which brings us to the next bit of this deliciously odd tale: how the cheese influenced the coach itself. See, when mail coaches first took to Britain's notoriously moody roads, they weren't purpose-built for high-speed dairy logistics. They were modified passenger stagecoaches. Some newer, some creaky, some held together with rust luck and a hearty smear of axle grease. But as the cheese quota became quietly standard, it began to shape coach design in subtle, squeaky ways. First, axle weight distribution. Cheese may not strike you as a structural material, but when you're calculating the center of gravity for a high-speed carriage laden with letters packages and 2 slightly hungover travelers, from Exeter placement matters. Guard seats were reinforced. Underbenches were widened. A small, discreet compartment, known colloquially among drivers as the cradle, was sometimes added just big enough for 2 round wheels and a folded rain cloak. Coach builders caught on. By the 1790s, a few private mail contractors even began advertising their vehicles as weight-balanced for dairy or stone, which in practice meant you could carry cheese or bricks without tipping. A selling point for mail efficiency and, oddly, for safety. Because a coach that balanced well-reduced sway, which meant fewer accidents, fewer broken axles, and fewer letters accidentally launched into a hedgerow. But not everyone agreed on best practices. Historians still argue whether the rear axle cradle was standard by 1800 or simply a regional quirk in the West Country, where dairymen were more influential and cheese was practically currency. Some even claim that a few coaches from Somerset had custom clamps designed to hold specific cheese shapes, though no physical example has survived, and skeptics suggest it might just be romantic nonsense from a cheddar-obsessed chronicler. Still, there's no denying the cheese had impact. Take the guard's perch, for instance. Perched high in the rear, the guard had one job above all: keep the mail safe, even if it meant shooting someone. Yes, they were armed, but they also managed the coach's internal weight. Letters up front, cheese at the back. Passenger with a heavy travel trunk, shift a wheel under the opposite seat. It was postal feng shui with a dairy twist. One famous coach company out of Bristol even trained their guards on balance theory, a series of best practices for adjusting cargo mid-journey. The unofficial manual included such gems as one Wiltshire wheel may offset one full satchel. Better two small Cheshires than one large red Leicester. When in doubt, double stack and hope the road holds. Cheese, it turns out, has surprising mechanical integrity. With a firm outer rind and dense interior, a mature Gloucester could absorb shock, reduce rattle, and if wedged properly, prevent letters from sliding across the coach floor like disgruntled dominoes. Engineers noticed. In fact, when experimenting with suspension systems, some coach builders used stacked cheeses as temporary dummies to test frame vibration. One diary from a coachwright in Nottingham reads, "Set 3 Gloucesters in cradle. Rode like silk. Must try it again with sandbags, but cheese more agreeable to staff." By the turn of the century, cheese had gone from edible curiosity to unofficial design parameter. Carriage interiors had smoother compartments. Straps were adjusted to allow easy cheese removal. And a few more modern designs even featured sloped footwells ostensibly for rain runoff, but coincidentally perfect for rolling cheese to the driver's reach. And the clatter. Oh, the clatter. Passengers began identifying parts of their journey not by landscape or weather, but by the particular thunk their cheese made on certain roads. "We've hit the reading rattle," they'd say, as the wheel bounced against the floor on a known stretch of uneven paving. One witty traveler claimed his cheese sounded out the route better than the guard's horn. Some towns even came to anticipate it. Children in Dorset were known to press their ears to the ground to hear the approaching cheese thunk of the evening mail. In smaller villages, the coach might arrive to find a huddle of locals betting on how many wheels it carried, based on the sound it made coming down the lane. There was even an incident in 1804 involving a cheese dislodging mid-descent on a wet Yorkshire hill, tumbling free and rolling spectacularly into a field of startled sheep. The guard, reportedly unfazed, leapt after it retrieved the rind-intact wheel and still made the scheduled departure from the next inn. The cheese, slightly bruised, was still fit for consumption. The sheep were less sure. And that's the charm of this entire arrangement. It's absurd, yes, but it worked. The cheese balanced the load. The coach was modified to welcome the cheese. The journey was smoother, the brakes more reliable, and the mail ever so slightly more dairy-infused. You bouncing along with the rest of the cargo can't help but marvel at how something so ordinary, so snackable, could become an integral part of national infrastructure. And under your boots, that round little wheel thuds contentedly with each turn of the road, a reminder that even history's great machines sometimes run on cheese. The rains eased off, now leaving behind a landscape of glittering puddles and gleaming cobblestones. The coach slows as it approaches another turnpike gate, the horses huffing steam like tiny locomotives. Inside, you stretch your aching legs and catch a glimpse of the toll keeper's lamp swinging outside. It's late and the coach is light on mail tonight, but once again, not on cheese. The guard taps his notes, double-checking the manifest. You lean in just slightly and notice a curious entry near the bottom one-passenger parcel dairy. The guard catches your eye and gives the faintest smirk. You nod. You get it now. But not everyone did, and certainly not the toll keepers and licensing officers whose job was to sniff out anything remotely profitable or illicit. And where there's a system with rules and blurry definitions, there are always those ready to bend them. Welcome to the seedy underbelly of the Georgian Turnpike, the world of cheese smuggling and loaf-shaped loopholes. You didn't expect this mail coach tale to involve deception, did you? Well, buckle your boots, because licensing laws and food taxes in the late 18th century made moving commercial goods like cheese a bureaucratic nightmare. If you were a dairyman, you couldn't just toss your wheels into a cart and expect to trot freely into town. You needed permits. You needed toll money. You needed the patience of a saint and the coin purse of a banker. Unless, of course, you could slip a wheel onto a mail coach. See, mail coaches had privileged access to certain routes. Their royal charter meant they passed through toll gates faster, sometimes cheaper, and with less inspection than your average merchant cart. Technically, they weren't supposed to carry commercial freight, just mail passengers and authorized ballast. But a cheddar slipped in under the bench, a Stilton wrapped in wool, and declared personal supper provisions. That wasn't unheard of. And toll keepers grew suspicious, especially when certain staging inns began offering cheese rentals. You'd hear it muttered in shadowy corners of coaching yards. Need a counterweight, sir? What sort local? Double stamped, can do 30 pounds flat. Bit aged, but she'll ride clean. Inns near major postal hubs like Worcester Bath and Bristol developed a quiet sideline in lending their stock for coach journeys. Sometimes they were returned, sometimes not. Occasionally, they were sold in the destination town as travel ripened. A few even bore tiny etchings to track them, primitive QR codes, if you will. Toll keepers caught wind. So did inspectors, especially after reports surfaced that some postmasters were collecting cheese handling fees. That was frowned upon. There was even a short-lived investigation by a parliamentary subcommittee on unauthorized dairy carriage, which mostly resulted in confused transcripts, a heated debate about rind thickness, and a reluctant declaration that there is no cause for legislative alarm at this time. Still, local enforcers took it seriously. Some toll gates began weighing coaches to absurd precision, using balances sensitive enough to detect the difference between a wheel of Cheshire and a meat pie. If the coach was slightly over the standard allowance, they'd ask questions. And if the answers were unsatisfying, out came the probe stick. It sounds dramatic, and it was. Toll keepers carried long iron poles designed to poke into hidden compartments beneath coaches. Ostensibly for safety checks, they were also good for knocking loose suspect cheeses. One document from 1806 describes a firm object, roughly spherical, dislodged near the axle. The guard claimed it was emergency ballast. The toll keeper noted it was edible and sharp in aroma. It was confiscated. The coach was fined. The passengers, 3 merchants and a clergyman, were reportedly devastated to lose their unofficial mid-journey snack. Now, not all cheese traffic was smuggling. Some was bureaucratically justified. You see, in certain regions, postmasters had the discretion to carry local produce samples on slow mail days, especially during agricultural fairs or cheese markets. The rationale showcasing rural Britain's dairy pride to the urban palate. But of course, such allowances were vague, and vague rules are a smuggler's dream. One particularly colorful figure was Edwin Crail, a postmaster in Wiltshire, who reportedly kept an entire cellar of demonstration cheeses for postal educational purposes. When questioned, he produced pamphlets on regional dairy heritage and insisted he was curating an exhibit. In reality, half his inventory rode out weekly on the London coach, destined for relatives' markets, or in one odd case, a cheese-themed wedding near Shoreditch. Crail was never charged, mostly because no one could prove where the line was between sample ballast and contraband. His educational exhibit reportedly grew so large, it attracted curious tourists and one mildly confused goat. Even so, the government couldn't crack down too hard. The mail system was working, and as long as the coaches stayed on time, the cheese mostly behaved, and the toll keepers had something to poke at. Occasionally, it all rolled along like a wheel of well-aged cheddar. Which is how you now find yourself, decades later, bouncing along on a coach that smells faintly of wool, wet wood, and something creamy and determined. You glance toward the guard. He's nodding off again. Under his bench, another wheel snug in its hidey hole. Likely rented, possibly taxed, absolutely essential. You close your eyes as the coach rattles into the next bend, thinking not about mail or tolls or the letter you're delivering, but about how much quiet history can be packed into a single round of cheese. You've nodded off again, but not for long. A jolt more than the usual thud of coach wheels snaps you back. The driver's muttering reins tight. The guard's no longer dozing. He's wide awake now, hand near his side where a polished flintlock pistol rests in its leather holster. You catch a glimpse of his eyes focused steady, the expression of someone trained for trouble. Trouble, it seems, has arrived. You'd think a mail coach would be a boring target for highwaymen, who'd risk their life to steal a sack of overdue tax forms and a few damp newspapers, but you'd be surprised. Especially when the rumor had spread that some of these coaches carried more than just letters, namely government documents, cash, and sometimes cheese valuable enough to melt a thief's resolve. You see, the Royal Mail took itself seriously. By the late 1700s, mail coaches were effectively treated like moving fortresses. Bright red paint, royal insignia, the iconic coach horn, all part of a bold statement, don't even try. But people did. So the guards were trained, armed, and empowered to defend the coach to the death if necessary, though most of them hoped it wouldn't come to that. And yes, some of them were defending cheese. To be clear, they weren't hired as dairy bodyguards. Their main job was protecting the sanctity of the post. But when mailbags got light and the cheese came on board as weight ballast or side cargo, it became part of the package. And once word got out that mail coaches occasionally carried goods, small parcels, sometimes money, and yes, valuable food items, robbers started sniffing around. There's a well-documented 1798 case from Somerset where two men on horseback attempted to stop a northbound mail coach near Frome. According to reports, they fired once missed and then shouted at the driver to throw down any valuables. The guard returned fire twice, and one robber fled. The other got a glancing shot to the arm, and the coach rolled on. What was recovered from the scene? One pistol, one tricorn hat, and a wedge of half-melted cheddar with a bite taken out of it. We may never know whether the cheese was part of the loot, the bait, or simply lunch. But it earned a place in the guard's official report, marked simply, "Cheese recovered. Damaged, but intact." This incident wasn't isolated. Guards began paying more attention to their dairy cargo, especially on long routes through lonely terrain. Wheels of cheese might not have glittered like gold, but to a desperate thief or a hungry man with poor impulse control, they were still worth grabbing. Some cheeses, rare-aged Stiltons or fancy French imports, were quite valuable and could be sold discreetly in city markets, which led to an unexpected outcome. the formal protection of certain cheeses. Postal guards began to categorize the cheese on board, if only informally. Ballast-only cheese, not for eating, not for selling. Shared provisions, guard supper. Private stock passenger property handled gently. Commissioned goods, merchant orders, or in-transfers often marked. And when something was marked as commissioned, the guard was responsible for it, same as the mailbags. That meant watching over it with the same diligence, and if necessary, defending it at musket point. This strange confluence of logistics and law turned Royal Mail Guards into reluctant cheese marshals, keeping smugglers at bay with one hand and robbers at bay with the other. Some guards even carried cheese manifests tallying the wheels on board by weight and origin, less for legal accountability, and more to avoid fines if something rolled off the coach mid-route. Historians still argue whether official policy ever recognized this, or whether it was just practical adaptation by overworked guards in an overly complicated system. But the documentation scraps of ledger entries, guard journals, even an old training memo from 1802 that reads, "In event of theft, prioritize dispatch satchel," and any bonded cheese suggests that this was a very real part of coach operations. Of course, not every threat was violent. Sometimes the cheese simply vanished. At one inn in Buckinghamshire, a guard reportedly left a wheel of Lancashire outside for just 10 minutes while changing horses. When he returned, it was gone. The innkeeper blamed a dog. The ostler blamed a farmhand. The guard suspected both and fined the inn. The cheese was never recovered. Its value 3 shillings and 8 pence, and 2 nights of grumbling from the replacement coach crew, who had to compensate with a sack of cabbages instead. Cabbages, it turns out, are terrible ballast. And so you sit now inside this well-worn coach, watching the guards scan the hedgerows for silhouettes. There's no immediate danger, but the air feels charged. Under your bench, you feel the reassuring presence of your now familiar cheese wheel, heavy, solid, unassuming. You begin to understand just how much this coach relies on it. Not just to balance weight, but to stabilize routine. To give the guard something to stack his boots against. To justify a toll receipt. To explain a schedule. To quietly remind everyone on board that this system is old, yes, but it works. Cheese in this moment is not just food. It's legacy. It's routine. It's an object so ordinary that its extraordinary role in this carefully wound machine goes unnoticed until someone tries to take it. You lean back. The guard relaxes again. The storm's passed. The pistol goes back into its holster, and with a quick blast of the horn, the coach rumbles forward once more. The road stretches on. The mail moves forward. The cheese, thank goodness, stays put. The road begins to smooth out now, or maybe your spine has finally gone numb. Either way, the jolts are less bone-rattling and more rhythmic, like a lullaby played by horseshoes. Outside, the countryside darkens into a charcoal blur of hedgerows, church steeples, and distant flickers of cottage hearths. You can hear the guard softly humming to himself, a tune barely distinguishable from the rumble of the wheels. It's a good moment to think about what this all meant. Not just the cheese, not just the coaches, but the larger impact of having a working, predictable system, a network that tied Britain together by strings of post bags, hoofbeats, and yes, the occasional waxed Gloucester wheel. Before the mail coach revolution, letters were erratic, unpredictable luxuries. One might arrive in 4 days or 40. A widow in Bath might not hear of her son's injury in Plymouth until weeks after his recovery. A merchant in York might ship goods to London and not receive payment or confirmation for months. News was gossip, and gossip moved slowly. Then came the mail coaches. They changed everything. You're riding inside what's effectively the first national delivery infrastructure, a web of routes crossing counties, rivers, and class lines. Suddenly, a letter sent on Monday might arrive by Wednesday. Suddenly, people could plan, coordinate, argue, rejoice, complain in detail and with reliable postage. And underpinning this new system was a series of quiet, practical decisions like balancing coach weight with cheese. It's bizarre, but it's also pure logistics. Without stable loads, coaches would wear unevenly, break down, fail their schedules. And when your business model promises consistency, nothing is worse than unpredictability. So the cheese wasn't just a quirk, it was a solution to a system-level problem. And the system responded in kind. Postmasters adapted. They started tracking average mail weights by season, heavier in winter, more parcels, lighter in summer, fewer letters, more elopements. They noted regional weight fluctuations. Durham postmasters, for instance, reported that harvest season saw lighter mailbags, but more food-related ballast, which probably meant lots of cheese. Inns evolved. Some began pre-positioning standard weights. Others started charging small balancing fees if their cheese was used and consumed along the route. The term cheese deposit appears in at least 3 inn ledgers from the 1790s. In one case, an inn in Gloucester offered passengers the chance to purchase weight cheese for a reduced rate, 1 wheel for your comfort and 1 for the Queen's mail. Even the public began to rely on the rhythm of the mail coach. People would gather near post roads to listen for the horn. Clerks kept ink fresh for expected letters. Romantic correspondents developed elaborate code systems in case their letters were intercepted, because with more speed came more risk of sensitive information arriving too quickly. And yes, cheese still mattered. Guards came to know which dairies made the most reliable wheels. Some would request specific cheeses by name. One guard was said to prefer the sweaty ones from Wiltshire they never shift on corners. Another insisted on traveling with only hard rind varieties, as soft cheeses go squishy when sat on accidentally by a bishop. Historians still debate whether cheese was ever formally recorded as a regular postal commodity, or if its place in the system remained purely informal. But a surprising number of surviving postal guides, especially regional copies, include vague references to stabilizing ballast or local produce integration. It's enough to convince most that cheese was at the very least officially tolerated. And here's the quietly radical part the system kept working. Mail got through, schedules held, routes expanded. The Postal Service, once a joke about delay and decay, became a model of modern logistics. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And in many ways, it worked because it embraced small, silly-seeming solutions, like cheese. Your coach pulls into a staging post now. The horses are panting foam, lathering their flanks, eyes wide but well-trained. The driver hops down to check the harnesses. The guard unlocks the mail trunk. A sleepy porter approaches with a lantern, blinking at the coach, then at the bundle under your seat. He nods at it. Is that one riding through to Bristol? The guard shrugs. Might be. The porter offers a quiet chuckle. Smells like it's already halfway there. There's no form to fill out. No receipt to sign. The cheese stays. It does its job. Just one more silent worker in a vast, clattering machine. As the fresh horses are clipped into place and the lanterns relit, you feel something settle inside you. It's not comfort exactly. It's the feeling that comes when everything is working the way it's supposed to, even if the glue holding it all together is round, waxed, and dairy-based. You lean back as the coach jerks forward again, the horn blaring once across the damp night. Somewhere ahead, more hills, more toll gates, more moments where cheese will be checked, measured, doubted, and defended. And always the mail will go through. The stars are out now, shimmering above in a sky so clear it could have been scrubbed. You peer through the coach window as the landscape glides past like an old tapestry, stitched fields, blackthorn hedges, crooked stone fences, holding in secrets and sheep alike. It's quiet except for the hum of wheels and the faint scent of horse leather and that ever-loyal round of cheese underfoot. You start to wonder what happens when the cheese gets there. Because all this time you've ridden alongside it, watched toll keepers inspect it, seen guards defend it, heard it thud through the wheel wells of a nation on the move. But where does it go in the end? Is it eaten, sold, returned, or simply replaced? Well, as with most things Georgian and practical, the answer is yes to all of the above. Let's talk about what happened to the cheese when the coach arrived at its destination. If it was ballast only, it often went right back into service. Many staging inns and coaching depots had house wheels, cheeses kept solely for the purpose of riding coaches. These weren't for eating. They were usually too dry, too cracked, too exposed to road filth. They were functional dairy, and they served until they split, molded, or began to smell louder than the horses. One famous coaching inn in Oxford kept a blackened Cheshire under lock and key, so old and cracked that it had its own nickname, Old Squeaky. It reportedly rode over 1,500 miles across the Midlands before finally being retired and ceremoniously buried in the stable yard. A marker stone reads, Cheese, 1791-1793, loyal service. If the cheese was commissioned freight, it would be collected by a porter or merchant at the depot. These cheeses had destinations, city shops, gentlemen's clubs, or wealthy townhouses, where a proper wheel of Lancashire was as much a status symbol as it was a food item. Guards were expected to ensure these reached their owners intact, though accidents did happen. There's a record from 1807 of a Stilton arriving in London cracked clean in half, reportedly after the coach hit a pheasant. The guard was fined a shilling. The cheese was eaten anyway. Sometimes, if there was extra cheese on board, say an emergency ballast added last minute in Exeter, it might be sold at the depot. Not for profit officially, but as a kind of incidental surplus. Porters would note the weight market on a chalkboard, and any coach worker could buy it for supper. Innkeepers loved it. Guards, tired and underpaid, loved it more. It became a small sub-economy of second-hand cheese trading hands in dim stables and lantern-lit tap rooms. One popular phrase among coachmen was, "Don't trust a depot without a wheel to spare." But not all cheese made it to the depot. Sometimes it was eaten en route. You'd think guards wouldn't touch their cargo, but late at night when the road was endless and the inns behind schedule, a guard might slice a sliver from a soft wheel just to test it, or a passenger might negotiate. "You let me ride with my knees in your lap and I'll share this Wensleydale I've got tucked in my valise." Deals were struck, rations were swapped. The occasional cheese went missing, later blamed on rat's bumps or divine disappearance. Historians still argue whether guards were ever formally allowed to eat the cheese. No surviving postal rule explicitly forbids it, but one 1802 training guide reminds guards that food intended for transport is not for mouth nor knife, which feels suspiciously targeted. Meanwhile, back at the depots, the cheeses that weren't eaten or sold were often rotated out, replaced with fresher wheels from local dairymen. This kept the quota stocked and kept innkeepers happy. After all, it gave their produce a direct route to major cities. And so cheese became a kind of traveling currency, a circular good that moved with the coaches, not just because it was useful, but because it was part of the ecosystem. It was bought, bartered, borrowed, weighed, sniffed, cracked, tasted, taxed, poked, and occasionally flung. It became so common in the mail system that some passengers simply assumed it was a normal part of the journey, like stamps or a slow leak. You lean forward now and glance at the guard again. He's whittling something absent-mindedly, a stick or maybe a cheese knife. You're not sure. Beneath your seat, the wheel of cheese thumps gently as the coach curves onto the final stretch of road before the next stop. You realize something, you've grown oddly fond of it. It's not even your cheese, but it's been with you the whole way. It's buffered the bumps, anchored the coach, smelled faintly of hay and sweat and cream. It has a name now in your head, Reginald. You hope Reginald survives the trip. You hope someone at the depot picks him up, or that he's returned to his usual route with a small note pinned to his cloth. Well-written, mildly dented, "Do not slice" on left flank. Because behind every Georgian letter, every schedule, every long, shivering, overnight journey through fog and mud, there's something holding it all steady. And sometimes that something is a wheel of cheese. The moon's high, now pale and cool as skimmed milk, casting long shadows across the hedgerows as your coach clatters on. You're not sure how long it's been since the last staging post. Time stretches strangely out here, where the countryside slips by like a forgotten lullaby. But you do know one thing for certain. You are riding inside one of the strangest, most meticulously choreographed logistics systems of the pre-industrial world. And your feet are still resting on a cheese. Tonight's journey feels timeless, but the world is changing fast. The Georgian mail coach system is near its peak, now humming along with clockwork precision. Dozens of routes, hundreds of coaches, thousands of letters, and nestled quietly beneath it all, 1,000 wheels of cheese doing a job nobody fully acknowledges, but everyone quietly relies on. And that's what this part of the story is really about, the invisible systems. The ones that seem absurd from the outside. The ones that only exist because people collectively decide to let them exist. Like cheese quotas. Because here's the secret, no one wants to admit the cheese quotas weren't always official. There was never a single decree stamped by the crown that declared henceforth all coaches shall carry a minimum of one dairy item for structural stability. No brass plaque, no national cheese register, no uniform weight-to-rind ratio. It wasn't law, it was custom reinforced by routine necessity and a shared understanding among the people who kept the wheels turning. In the coaching world, unspoken rules often carried more weight than official ones. Drivers knew what inns would provide good horses and what ones would serve you stew that tried to kill you. Guards knew which toll-keepers could be reasoned with and which ones had an unhealthy enthusiasm for poking things with their sticks. And everyone knew that a mail coach riding too light might earn a fee, a lecture, or worse, a delay. So they improvised. Cheese filled the gap, sometimes literally. What began as a one-time ballast solution, probably born of desperation, evolved into an accepted, even expected part of the system. A traveling cheese wasn't questioned. It became its own justification. Oh, that wheel, that's for balance. Nobody argued. Everyone nodded. The system rolled on. Historians still argue whether this counts as a quota in the strict sense. There are no central records, no nationwide cheese tally, just anecdotes, local records, inn ledgers, and the stubborn persistence of cheese-shaped indentations in 200-year-old coach floorboards. But it functioned like a quota. Enough people believed in it, counted on it, worked around it, that it might as well have been carved into stone. And it wasn't just the guards and drivers. Passengers started to adopt the custom too. They'd show up at the coach with wheels of their own. Some truly were personal rations, sure, but many quietly doubled as weight offerings. A small thanks to the coach, a sort of travel insurance policy. In at least one known case, a wealthy widow named Agnes Featherston reportedly insisted on bringing the same wheel of cheese on every journey from Bath to London, wrapped in silk, seated beside her in its own padded box. It wasn't for eating. It wasn't for sale. She simply believed her trips were smoother when Sir Cheddar came along, and no one stopped her. Why would they? The wheel helped. That was enough. It's worth noting, too, that cheese was not the only item used for balance. Records show the occasional salted ham bundle of books, sack of rocks, or even in one delightfully odd case, a stuffed taxidermy fox. But none were as consistent. None had the durability, the convenience, the delightful side benefit of being edible in an emergency. Cheese, you might say, became the default solution to physical imbalance and bureaucratic ambiguity. There's something wonderfully human about that, and it didn't just stay on the roads. The idea bled into other corners of the mail system. Some riverboats carrying mail reportedly stowed cheese as trim weight. One canal boat ledger from 1811 includes the note "Ballast, loaded 2 sacks, oats, 1 wheel cheese, 1 sleeping dog." No further explanation. Even early rail mail services, when they eventually rattled onto the scene, briefly used food crates for weight testing. The Great Western Railway's early test runs reportedly included 60-pound wheels of Gloucester, just to simulate passenger load. Was it tradition, efficiency? Just a cheeky nod to the old ways? Probably all three. Which brings us back to the coach beneath you and the wheel of cheese gently shifting with each turn. You feel it now, how much has been built atop this little dairy disc. Not just your boots, not just the floorboards, but the very rhythms of an empire trying to run on time. And all because someone once decided that if the coach was light, they might as well throw on a wheel of Wensleydale. You smile just a little and close your eyes again. The guard hums something wordless. The horn sounds in the distance, another stop drawing near, and the cheese rolls on. Dawn is creeping in now, a pale watercolor smudge behind the trees, gently turning the sky from charcoal to pearl. The world looks half-washed, like the countryside has just rolled out of bed and isn't quite sure whether to dress or just keep dozing. The coach presses forward, one creaky axle at a time, toward the edge of a new morning. You stretch your legs, shift your back, and hear the soft scuff of the cheese wheel beneath your boots. Still there. Still riding shotgun as always. And just ahead, the faint outline of the next coaching-in chimney, already puffing doors open like arms waiting to catch you. But before we disembark, let's talk about what happened when things went wrong. Because as smooth and reliable as the mail coach system became, there were hiccups, crashes, delays, a few spectacular misadventures, and cheese somehow often found itself right in the middle. Let's start with the time a wheel of Cheshire derailed a whole delivery. It's 1803. A coach is running late out of Birmingham. Rain's been falling in sheets, and the road has turned into a brown ribbon of slop. The horses are spooked, the driver's irritable. The guard trying to stabilize the rear axle decides to move the cheese from under one bench to the other, balancing the load, except he miscalculates. The wheel slips mid-turn, rolls across the floor like a cannonball, and wedges under the driver's seat, jamming the brake. What happens next? A 5-foot ditch, a broken axle, and a cascade of letters raining down into a sheep field. The cheese miraculously survives. The coach, not so much. That incident was recorded in detail in the Birmingham Mail dispatch log, complete with a diagram of cheese trajectory versus road curve. It became the butt of jokes for months. One poet even published a limerick that ended with, "If ballast you seek, take a wedge, not a wheel, or the post will go flying, your fate firmly sealed." It's one of many such moments. There's the Leicester loaf incident of 1799, when a mislabeled cheese confused with a bread delivery apparently was stacked too high. in the coach boot threw off the balance on a steep hill and rolled free into a river. Two fishermen tried to net it. One slipped. The cheese floated downstream. The guard was fined 2 shillings and told never to accept dairy from unknown bakers again. Or the Midlands mold affair, in which an improperly sealed wheel of soft cheese burst during a heat wave and soaked 3 mailbags with a pungent, creamy seepage. The letters were salvaged, sun-dried, and according to local reports, retained an aroma most unfit for polite society. And of course, the more mundane delays, cheese going missing, misplaced, misidentified. In many cases, guards had to fill out loss reports, not just for letters, but for ballast. One surviving complaint reads, passenger cheese removed during staging transfer. Suspect porter. No signature provided. Strong scent of theft. But even with these mishaps, the system held. Because the coaches didn't stop. The mail still moved. And the cheese, it bounced, cracked, seeped, escaped, spoiled, and occasionally exploded. But it remained part of the story. A variable to be managed. A tool, not just a snack. A reminder that even the most finely tuned machines are only ever human at heart. And sometimes, very daring. Historians still argue whether any of these incidents were truly catastrophic or just amusing footnotes exaggerated by guards with a flair for drama and too much time to write in the margins of ledgers. But there's no denying the paper trail, dozens of anecdotes, receipts, and complaints, all circling back to that same odd truth cheese, however silly mattered. It's oddly comforting, really, to know that even back then, in the hustle of cobbled roads and clipped syllables and horse-thundered nights, things went wrong. Wheels broke, plans failed, packages got soggy, but they found ways to laugh about it, to fix it, to try again. And always someone remembered to bring the cheese. So now, as the coach lurches into the courtyard of the next inn, your destination, you glance once more at the wheel under your feet. It's scuffed now, maybe a little flatter on one side, but still whole. Still riding, still doing its job. You smile as the driver hops down with a grunt, and the guard opens the door with a practiced gesture. Light spills in, birds chirp, a pot of something warm and tea-colored steams on a table nearby. Watch your step, the guard says, gesturing to the wheel. Passenger cheese gets twitchy in the mornings. You laugh just softly and step out. One journey ends, another begins, and somewhere behind you, a wheel of Gloucester rolls gently to a stop, awaiting its next ride. The inn yard is bustling now. Boots clapping against flagstones, stable boys darting between steaming horses, and porters grunting under the weight of mail sacks and travelers' trunks. You stretch stiff legs and shake the night from your shoulders, feeling like a letter that's been folded too long. The sky is brighter by the minute, smeared with streaks of pink and pewter. But you're not done yet. Because while your journey may have ended, the coach's hasn't, nor has the cheese's. It's being checked now, gingerly lifted by a porter, with the kind of care usually reserved for newborns or highly suspicious fruitcakes. He inspects the cloth wrapping, nods to himself, and disappears inside the depot. And just like that, your traveling companion is gone. You half expect someone to thank it. This moment, quiet and oddly ceremonial, marks one of the many handoffs in a staggeringly complex system. Coaches didn't just trundle from point A to point B, they operated in relays with horses, swapped loads, redistributed, and cargo reassigned at every major stop, including the cheese. Now that it's in the depot, the wheel will be assessed, possibly rewrapped, and either sent forward on the next leg of the journey, or rotated back into local stock. Some cheeses are tagged for onward travel, especially if they're part of known merchant shipments. Others might be set aside, returned to the originating inn, or even auctioned off if their ownership is unclear. That's right, postal cheese auctions. They weren't common, but they existed quiet sales held in depot kitchens or back rooms when a cheese had outlived its manifest. After a certain number of days, unclaimed, the innkeeper or postmaster could legally dispose of the wheel. Most often it ended up on someone's table, sliced thin and served with bread and heavily qualified apologies. One surviving inn ledger from 1809 includes this note: cheese weight 26 lbakr, received from Exeter coach, unclaimed by sender. Mild aroma. Sold to Mrs. Halloway for 4 shillings and 1 rhyme about goats. It's easy to laugh now, but think of it. This is a system flexible enough to make poetry a form of payment, and resilient enough to move thousands of pounds of mail weekly, while still remembering where it left the cheddar. And make no mistake, the cheese was remembered. Postmasters had their own internal bookkeeping systems. Some even had shorthand nicknames for frequent cheese types coded by region and weight class. There's a note from a London depot that reads, CWH 14 lb mild usual spot behind stove, referring to a recurring wheel of Cotswold hard that apparently liked to show up late and shiver. Historians still argue whether this level of detail was a sign of postal excellence or just the result of too many overworked clerks with limited hobbies. But either way, the documentation is there. Lists, notes, descriptions so specific, you'd think cheese was a passenger with a surname and a seat number, and in a way it was. Because even now, as your coach rumbles off into the distance, new cheeses are being loaded into it, carefully selected, placed to balance the axle, wrapped tightly against road jostle. If one cracks, another waits in the cellar. If a porter forgets it, someone will notice the tilt within the hour. And it's not just cheese anymore. With the system running so efficiently, the coaches started to carry more than they were meant to. Small parcels, hand-delivered trinkets, wedding invitations, a bottle of medicine for someone's cousin in Cheltenham, an envelope tucked under the guard's cap marked with a heart and smelling faintly of lavender. The coaches became trust machines. They weren't perfect things, still got lost or delayed, but people believed in them. And belief, as it turns out, is the true fuel of logistics. Belief that a wheel of Gloucester will arrive in one piece. Belief that the horn will sound at midnight and again at dawn. Belief that something so ordinary, mail cheese travel, can also be remarkable. And through it all, the cheese remains. Even as railways begin to stretch their fingers across the map, even as steam whistles start to edge out hoofbeats, the cheese holds its place for now. Because nothing else is as conveniently wheel-shaped, stackable, sturdy, and edible. You don't pack your coach with pears. You don't stuff cabbages under the guard's bench. But cheese is reliable. It knows the roads. It knows the bumps. It's been here before. You sip something warm, now strong tea or weak coffee, it hardly matters, and lean against the stable wall. The inn is stirring into full day, the postmaster barking names, and a porter hauling another weighty wheel toward the next outbound coach. You watch it go, round, solid, unflustered by centuries. You're not sure whether to salute it or sigh. You do neither. You just nod slowly, as if to say, thank you. Safe travels. Keep everything in balance, old friend, and the wheel rolls on. You're walking now, boots tapping lightly down the post road as the town wakes up around you. Bakery shutters creak open. A milk cart trundles past. Somewhere a rooster crows with the unearned confidence of someone who didn't spend all night in a coach. You've disembarked, but the journey lingers like crumbs in your coat pocket, or the faint scent of aged cheddar clinging to your socks. And as you walk, your mind drifts not to the destination, but to the system you've just stepped out of. Because make no mistake, the Georgian mail coach network was one of the most elegant systems of its time. a marvel of schedule muscle paperwork and lightly weaponized dairy. It worked not just because of brilliant design, but because thousands of people across Britain quietly chose to keep it running night after night, wheel after wheel, letter after letter. And most of them were not trying to be remembered. The coach drivers rarely signed their names. Guards sometimes left initials, if that. Porters, toll collectors, ostlers, cheese wrappers, grooms, clerks. They all moved in a kind of soft choreography that left few footprints in the history books, which is strange given how much history they were carrying. Royal decrees, love letters, livestock licenses, blackmail attempts, birthday cards, war news, a recipe for jam tarts, someone's confession, someone else's dream, all of it jostling together in a trunk secured with twine and a frown. And of course, cheese. Not because it was glamorous, not because it was noble, but because it worked. Because it made the coach ride better. Because if the mailbags were light that day, and the axle creaked, and the guard had a suspicious cramp in his knee, then yes, a wheel of Derbyshire blue was exactly what the Empire needed. This, more than anything, reveals the weirdly democratic soul of the system. Not built by lords or generals or visionaries, built by habits, by tweaks, by the quiet realization that if you don't have enough paper to weigh down your coach, a well-wrapped Wensleydale will do just fine. And the cheese knew its role. It wasn't fussed about being ballast. It didn't insist on a title. It didn't need to be displayed or honored or included in the Christmas bonuses. It just sat there unassuming, slightly musty, and structurally crucial. Historians still debate how widespread the cheese custom really was. Some argue it only happened in the West Country or the Midlands. Others insist it was national, even international. A few skeptics say it's all been exaggerated by overzealous cheese romantics, a real phrase. But the paper trail is undeniable, and more importantly, the oral trail. Because long after the coaches themselves disappeared, the stories remained. Old coachmen in their twilight years would still talk about that wheel that split in a hailstorm, or the one that squeaked whenever we passed Banbury. Guards wrote poems about cheese gone wrong. Innkeepers toasted their favorite cheeses by name. Children growing up near the old coach roads would be told bedtime tales of heroic cheeses that saved entire routes from disaster. One famous folk rhyme collected in Yorkshire in the 1830s goes, "Cheese on the axle, cheese on the floor, cheese in the boot, and behind every door." If the guard has his musket and the driver his hat, then give thanks to the cheddar that rides in the back. It's silly, it's sweet, and yet it says more than any official record. Because systems are sustained by belief. You believe the coach will arrive. The guard believes the road will hold. The innkeeper believes the horses won't throw a shoe. And somehow everyone believes the cheese will do its part. It's not about dairy. It's about trust, and so you keep walking. The sun's warm now, brushing your shoulders. A boy on a pony races by clutching a small satchel marked with a wax seal, perhaps another letter, another story, another future being delivered. And somewhere still rolling down some misty road hooves, pounding horn, blaring, another coach rides with its precious cargo. Letters, parcels, quiet thoughts wrapped in folded paper. And somewhere beneath a passenger's boots, a round, humble wheel of cheese, doing what it's always done, holding everything together. You've wandered beyond the town now, up a slope where the old coach road cuts through rolling fields and blackberry thickets. There's a stile to rest on, and so you do coat bunched behind your back, a breath of morning mist curling in your throat like steam. The road stretches out ahead, long and quiet, a perfect ribbon of what used to be. And you sit thinking about just how much was packed into that battered, bouncing little coach. Not just letters or passengers, not just coins in pouches or umbrellas tied with string, but a whole national rhythm choreographed down to the hoofbeat. Think of the scale, hundreds of coaches departing from dozens of cities, all timed to cross paths like gears in a clock. One delay in Leeds might ripple down to Bristol. A snowstorm in Derby could delay a birthday card in Dover. It was all tightly wound, and it ran miraculously on time. And yes, sometimes it ran on cheese. Let's not be too poetic about it. There were flaws. Mail was sometimes tampered with. Accidents happened. Routes were grueling, even dangerous. Guards were underpaid. Horses were overworked. Passengers got grumpy damp and a little green around the edges. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And it kept working for one very British reason: everyone involved was deeply committed to muddling through anyway. And the cheese, it kept showing up. There were even entire supply routines dedicated to it. Certain dairies developed quiet relationships with innkeepers. A postmaster in Worcester might request 2 standard ballast wheels monthly. A Wiltshire farmer might receive a note, send 1 riding cheese and 1 serviceable for supper. There was no formal agreement, just the mutual nod of understanding that something solid was needed to keep the mail running true. And if your wheel could survive 200 miles of potholes, freezing fog, and the occasional misplaced boot well, it earned its reputation. Some dairymen even bragged about it. One noted cheesemaker in Shropshire advertised his goods in the Staffordshire Chronicle with the tagline, "As ridden with royal mail, thrice weekly, without complaint." And locals swore that a particular cheese's texture could be judged not by taste, but by how many stops it had endured. You didn't just slice it, you respected it. Historians still puzzle over whether this counts as one of the first examples of what we'd now call performance branding. But it's no stretch to say that, at least in coaching circles, a cheese that rode well sold well. If it could survive the jolts and thuds of a hard journey, it was clearly made of something trustworthy. You glance down the slope now and imagine the coach returning the glint of the guard's musket, the slap of reins, the driver's muffled complaints about pheasants or weather or taxis, and in the boot, a familiar round silhouette. Maybe it's the same cheese, maybe not. But the idea remains. The concept of cheese as companion, as stabilizer, as the thing that lets a larger structure stay steady when the rest is in flux. And somehow that seems deeply modern. After all, our world still runs on strange ballast. USB sticks taped under desks, paperweights shaped like pineapples, random mugs on news anchors' tables. We still trust the odd and the ordinary to keep the important things grounded. In the Georgian era, it was cheese. You close your eyes for a moment, now feeling the breeze. In the distance, a bell chimes. Someone's cow begins its morning grumble. A coach may not pass this way today, or even this week, but the road remembers. The grooves are still there, and if you pressed your ear to the stone, you might just hear the faint echo of a wheel. Not wooden, not iron, but waxed, wrapped, and aged to perfection. Still doing its part. Still keeping the world balanced, one bumpy mile at a time. You're back on your feet now, following the old coach road as it curves gently downhill through an open stretch of countryside. The hedges are lower here, letting in more light. There's dew on the grass, and a pair of birds flit overhead like punctuation marks in a sentence too long and lovely to end just yet. Ahead, a milestone leans into the earth, half swallowed by moss. The numbers are worn down to ghosts, but you know the direction. This is the road the coaches took. Still takes in some ghostly fashion. And under all of it, beneath the wood and iron and sweat, still echoes the absurdly practical genius of Georgian logistics. By now you understand it wasn't just about mail or even speed. It was about consistency, about the ability to say, "You'll have this in 3 days," and mean it. That kind of reliability reshaped lives. It allowed merchants to plan stock, families to arrange reunions, soldiers to write home, and lovers to promise visits with actual dates. The mail coach created a sense of national rhythm, and while it wasn't perfect, it was stable, predictable, structurally sound, often thanks to cheese. Because when you strip it all back, the thunder of hooves, the rattle of wheels, the swirling capes of guards, and the pressed collars of passengers, what kept the coach steady on the road wasn't heroism or grandeur. It was ballast. It was weight. It was a round, solid, slightly smelly assurance that things wouldn't tip too far to one side. That may sound ridiculous. But then again, the world is mostly run on ridiculous things. Paper money, ceremonial wigs, tiny voting pencils on fraying bits of string, and yes, wheels of cheese stuffed under benches to make sure the letters arrive on time. Historians still wonder whether the cheese quota, unofficial as it was, represents a rare kind of quiet innovation, a non-heroic invention. Not a light bulb or a cannon or a constitution, just a wheel of dairy solving a problem nobody wanted to admit existed. And that makes it beautiful, because it reminds you that not every solution needs to be clever. Some just need to be soft enough to absorb shock, hard enough to stay intact, and tasty enough to double as lunch in a pinch. You reach the top of a hill, now turn and look back. The road winds behind you like a memory vanishing into trees dipping between fields. And for just a moment, you imagine a coach there. The red livery, the clop of hooves, the guard's horn cutting through the mist, inside mail, passengers, possibly a small dog. And below all that, between the thrum of boots and the bounce of boxes, rests a single wheel of Gloucester, doing its job, keeping the ride level, holding the system steady, helping the world move forward by not moving at all. You smile, you sigh, you keep walking. Because even now in your own life, you have your versions of traveling cheese. Little things that keep you grounded. Maybe it's an old book you never finish, a song that always rebalances your thoughts, a chipped mug, a half-written list, a quiet ritual before bed. Things that don't need to be flashy, just reliable, quiet ballast. And that's how the mail got through. Not by brilliance, by cheese. And now, as the sun warms the last of the coach road and the shadows grow long across the fields, your thoughts begin to slow. There's something wonderfully soothing about the image, isn't there? A coach creaking through the night, pulled by steady horses, guided by quiet people doing quiet jobs. No drama, no grandeur, just motion, just purpose. And somewhere underfoot, a wheel of cheese humming its silent note of balance. You feel your own thoughts starting to settle now, edges softening, mind loosening like the straps of a satchel at the end of a long journey. You've wandered through schedules and saddle sores, through ballast and bureaucracy. You've seen how even the most peculiar customs, the most unexpected solutions can hold a system together. Not with brilliance, but with persistence. And that maybe is the real lesson here. You don't have to be dazzling. You don't have to be the driver or the hornblower or the one who gets their name in ledgers. Sometimes it's enough to be the thing that keeps everything else from tipping too far in one direction. To be steady, quiet, useful, to be cheese. So let that thought wrap around you now, soft as wool, slow as hooves, and round as a wheel tucked beneath a velvet seat. The mail has gone through. The letters have been delivered. The coach has rolled on. And you can rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.